She stuffed a large, well-salted crust between his teeth, held her apron out like a sack under his mouth, and thoughtfully watched him eat. Siganuk, playful as a young horse himself, pranced up to her and said, "That's a clever gelding you've got there. Fine horse." "Go away and stop wagging your tail about," cried grandmother, stamping her foot. "You're in my bad books today." She explained to me that he had stolen more than he had bought at the market. If grandfather gives him 5 rubles, he'll spend 3 rubles and steal 10 rubles worth. He likes stealing. He tried it once and wasn't found out, and everyone laughed and praised him for his success. And after that it became a habit with him. From the time he was a young boy, grandfather had his full taste of poverty, and now old age has made him greedy, and money means more to him than his own children. He's only too pleased to get something for nothing. As for Mikhail and Yakov, she waved her hand and fell silent for a moment. Then she looked at her open snuff box and grumbled. "It's all as complicated as a piece of lace, Alexei, spun by a blind woman. You can't make any pattern out of it. If they catch Ivan stealing, he'll be beaten to death." After a short silence, she added in a soft voice, "Ah, well, there's a lot of rules, but there's no real truth in them." Next day I pleaded with Siganuk to stop stealing. "If you don't, you'll get beaten to death." "They'll never catch me. I'm too clever for them. I've a fast horse," he said, laughing, and then suddenly frowned with a sad expression on his face. "Of course stealing is wicked and dangerous as well. I do it from boredom. I don't manage to save any money with those uncles of yours. In a week they cheat me out of it. But I don't care. They're welcome to it. I don't starve." Suddenly he picked me up and gently shook me. "You don't weigh much, but although you're thin, you've got good bones. You'll grow up to be very strong. Why don't you learn the guitar? Go and ask Uncle Yakov. The only thing is, you're still a bit on the small side, and for your size you've a nasty temper. Don't you like your grandfather?" "I'm not sure. Apart from grandmother, I don't like any of the Kashrins. Only the devil could like them." "What about me?" "You're a Peshkov, not a Kashrin. You've got a different blood. You're a different breed." Suddenly he squeezed me tight and said, almost in a groan, "If only I could sing, then I would set the town alight." It's time I did some work. He dropped me onto the floor, put a handful of tacks into his mouth, and started nailing a width of wet, dark material onto a large, square board, pulling it tight as he banged the nails in. Soon afterwards he was killed. This is how it happened. By the gates in the yard, leaning against the fence, was a large oak cross with a thick, gnarled stump at one end. It had been out there a long time. I noticed it when I first came to the house. Then it was new and yellow, but the autumn rains had blackened it considerably. It had the acrid smell of fumed oak, and there was really no use for it in that dirty, crowded yard. Uncle Yakov had bought it for his wife's grave and made a vow to carry it on his own shoulders to the cemetery on every anniversary of her death. This year the anniversary fell on a Saturday, at the beginning of winter. It was frosty, and the wind scattered the snow off the roof. Everyone had gone outside. Grandfather, grandmother, and the 3 grandchildren. Before anyone else was up, had gone to the cemetery for the memorial service. I had been left at home as a punishment for being naughty. The uncles, both wearing identical knee-length black fur coats, lifted the cross and stood under its arms. Gregory, and some man I hadn't seen before, lifted the heavy stump after a struggle and placed it across Siganuk's broad shoulders. He staggered and braced himself by setting his feet wide apart. "Think you'll make it?" asked Gregory. "I don't know. It's going to be hard." Uncle Mikhail shouted angrily, "Open the gates, you blind devil!" Uncle Yakov joined in. "Shame on you, Vanka. We're both thinner than you." But Gregory, as he swung the gates open, sternly advised Ivan, "Mind you, don't do yourself an injury." "You bald nitwit!" shouted Uncle Mikhail from the street. Everyone in the front yard laughed and talked loudly to show how pleased they were that someone was taking the cross away. "If you're lucky, grandfather won't beat you today. Looks as if he's in a good mood." Inside the workshop, he made me sit down on a pile of wool ready for dyeing, wrapped it round me up to my shoulders, and said pensively as he sniffed the steam rising from the vats, "I've known your grandfather for 37 years. I was with him when we started, and I won't leave him now. We used to be friends and started this business together. Thought everything up ourselves. He's a clever man, your grandfather. He set himself up as boss, but I wasn't smart enough. God knows more than all of us, though, he only has to smile to make a fool of the wisest man on earth. You don't understand the why and wherefore of things yet, but before long you'll have to. It's rough being an orphan. Your father, Maxim, was a fine man. He understood everything, and that's why grandfather hated him and wouldn't recognize him as his son-in-law. I loved listening to those kind words and watching the red and gold fire flickering in the stove, and the milky white clouds of steam rising over the vats, leaving a dove-colored crust like hoarfrost on the sloping rafters of the roof, where jagged chinks let through blue patches of sky. The wind died down and the sun came out, and the whole yard seemed sprinkled with ground glass. The screeching of sleighs came from the street, and light blue smoke curled up from the chimneys, and soft shadows glided over the snow as if they too had a story to tell. The tall, bony Gregory, hatless, with his long beard and large ears, looked like a kind-hearted magician as he stood there mixing the bubbling dye and continued the lesson. Never be afraid to look a person straight in the face. Even the dog that attacks you will run away. His heavy spectacles pinched the bridge of his nose, making its tip turn blue like my grandmother's. "What's that?" he said, all of a sudden, listening hard. He pushed the stove door shut with his foot and bounded through the yard. I rushed after him. In the middle of the kitchen floor, Siganuk was lying face upwards. Broad shafts of light came through the window, one falling on his chest, the other on his legs. His forehead shone with a strange light, and his eyebrows were raised high. Squinting eyes stared at something on the black ceiling. His dark lips trembled and blew out pinkish bubbles. Blood flowed from the corners of his mouth, across his cheeks, and onto his neck and down to the ground. It flowed in thick streams from under his back. Ivan's legs lay in an awkward heap, and his slippers, clearly soaked through, were stuck fast to the floorboards. The floor had recently been scrubbed clean with sand and shone like the sun. Little rivers of blood ran towards the doorway, glinting fiercely where they crossed the rays of light from the window. Siganuk lay motionless, and only his fingers stretched out by the side of his body moved and scratched at the floor, their dye-stained nails glittering in the sun. Yevgenia, our nanny, squatted by Ivan and tried to put a thin candle in his hand, but he couldn't grasp hold of it, and the candle fell into a pool of blood and went out. Nanny picked the candle up and wiped it on the corner of her apron and tried it once more to place it between his restless fingers. The kitchen was filled with whispers which rose and fell like waves. It was like a hard gale which tried to tear me from the door, but I clung hard to an iron clamp. "He tripped on something," Uncle Yakov said in a toneless voice, shuddering and twisting his head. All the color was drained from him, and he looked crumpled and disheveled. His eyes had lost their fire, and he blinked incessantly. "He fell, and it crushed him, right in the back. We would have caught it, but we let go. Just in time." "You killed him," said Grigory in an empty voice. "What are you talking about?" "You did it." The blood still flowed, and by the door it had collected onto a dark pool which somehow seemed to be growing higher. Foaming pink at the mouth, Siganuk bellowed as if he were having a bad dream, and he became flatter and flatter. His body clung close to the floor and sank gradually into it. "Mikhail's ridden off to church for father," whispered Yakov. "I piled him into a cab and got back here as soon as I could. A good thing I didn't carry the stump, or I'd be in the same mess." Once more Nanny pressed the candle into Siganuk's hand, and the wax fell with her tears onto his palm. Gregory said in a gruff voice, "Stick it to the floor near his head, stupid." "Yes, and take his cap off." Nanny took his cap off, and the back of his head hit the floor with a dull thud. Then it rolled over to one side, and the blood flowed more abundantly, but only from one corner of his mouth. It flowed for a horribly long time. At first I expected Siganuk to rest a little, sit up, spit something out, and say, "Whoa, it's hot in here." He always used to say this on Sundays when he woke up from his afternoon nap. Now he didn't get up, but he just lay there, his life ebbing away. The sun had already moved away from him, and the bright strips of light had shortened and fell on the windowsills. Siganuk had gone black all over, his fingers didn't move anymore, and the foam had dried from his lips. Around his head burnt 3 candles, their flickering golden spears lighting up his disheveled blue-black hair. his blood-stained teeth and the tip of his sharp nose throwing quivering yellow patches on his swarthy cheeks. Nanny, who was kneeling by him and weeping, whispered, "My angel, my light, my life." It was cold in the room, and I hid under the table in horror. Then my grandfather, in his raccoon fur coat, burst into the kitchen, followed by grandmother, who was wearing her cloak with the little tails hanging on the collar. Uncle Mikhail followed, along with a lot of strangers. Grandfather flung his coat on the floor and roared, "Bastards! Feel satisfied now that you've killed him? He would have been worth his weight of gold in 5 years." The heap of clothes which they'd flung down on the floor blocked my view of Ivan. I crawled out and stumbled against grandfather's legs. He kicked me away and shook his red fist menacingly at the uncles. "Wolves!" He sat on the bench, propped himself up with his arms, and sobbed. In a grating voice he said, "I knew well enough he was a spoke in your wheel. Poor Ivan, you weren't clever enough. What are we going to do now? Do you hear me? What have we done to make God treat us like this? Can you tell me, Mother?" Grandmother had flattened herself against the floor and was pinching Ivan's face, his head and his chest, breathing into his eyes and rubbing his hands. All the candles were knocked over. Then she wearily rose to her feet, in her shiny black dress, opened her eyes wide, and softly said, "Clear out, you bastards." Everyone except my grandfather left the kitchen. Sihanouk had a miserable little funeral, and there isn't much I can remember about it.